And welcome everybody to the January Community Food Projects Community of Practice. Thank you for being here. Thank you for making time out of your really busy and hectic days. If you're here, we know that you're involved in grants in some way, and we know that these last couple of days have been really, really hard and intense for all of us. I'll just quickly introduce the presenting team again. I'm Susan Lightfoot-Shemp from the Wallace Center and Food Systems Leadership Network, here with Emma Bliss from Institute for Social and Economic Development. We're partners on the Community Food Projects TA program. And we are very excited to bring into this community today Jeanette Abi-Nader, who is going to be sharing her learnings and practices and tools around community engagement for food justice work. Um, Quickly, just want to jump to our community agreements just to remind us of how we want to be together in this space. And all of our Food Systems Leadership Network convened spaces. We always ground ourselves in these cultural agreements, just recognizing that culture is alive. Culture is something that we co-create every time that we are together. And so reminding ourselves that together we know a lot. There's a lot of collective wisdom in this community of practice. So please bring forward your lived experience and your knowledge. Um, we are mindful of our power, privilege, and how much space we're taking up. We take responsibility for impact regardless of our intent. It's the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions, right? We give each other grace and approach conflict with curiosity. We challenge assumptions, respect our differences, and speak from our own experiences. We honor confidentiality, take care of our physical, mental, and emotional needs, and meet each other where we are. So just invite y'all to embrace these today and live into them. And if there's one that you really want to be mindful of today, please give yourself just a little reminder of, what's something that you really want to show up for today. I think we should just jump right over and right on time here. So Jeanette's been engaged in community food projects work for a long time. So Jeanette, I invite you to share a little bit about your background. But as Andy Fisher and Emma and I have been learning from all of you and just getting a sense of the topics that really matter and what's alive within this community. This topic of community engagement and like authentic community engagement has come up repeatedly. And so we wanted to, just create a space and a conversation to dig into that some more and to do that in a way that actually like gives us real tools to move forward with. Um, and also just want to, be mindful of the fact that this can often be a very fraught conversation around community engagement. And I think we've learned a lot of good skills and also sometimes step in it. And so let's, use this space as a community of practice to try on new ideas, to be real about our failures and the times that we haven't done this well, and to be in this conversation in a spirit of collective learning. All of you have experience with this too. As I was saying, together we know a lot, so let's really bring that forward in our discussions today. So with that, Jeanette, I'm going to hand over the mic to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you for grounding us in the moment that we're in both its challenges and the small reliefs that we have. I must say I'm a bit overwhelmed by all you beautiful people. It is so good to be in this space, and we're talking about community engagement in this forum where there's around 100 of us on a screen, and so it's going to be really hard. We're going to try and practice it while we talk about it. Might be a little challenging, but we're going to do our best. And I appreciate being able to see all of you that are able to have your screens off, and no sweat if you're not. I wanted to just start by sharing a little bit of the responses that y'all have given. This is so small because there were so many, and I was typing as fast as I could to like put some of your things in here. But these are just a small um, collection of some of the stuff that I could capture that we were talking about, what makes us feel belonging. Most of it, if we look over this, has to do with connecting, nature, food, being together, our pets, singing, music, celebration. So all of these things. I think one thing that's not on here is also really connecting during times of challenge, and feeling a sense of belonging in that shared struggle, which we do so often, which is something for me too. And so I just wanted to take a minute to introduce myself and talk about um, what belonging means to me and what that's about. And as Susan said, I've been in the food justice action for like maybe 3 decades, maybe a little bit more, which really speaks to my age and to the challenge I might have with this kind of forum, right? Um, but I think for me, belonging and connecting is really about this sense of coming together for a shared intention, for the shared community change and bringing our hearts and our intentions to that. And so my work today, we're going to pull from two main areas of focus in work. One is right now, I'm the Deputy Director of Justice and Programs for Piedmont Housing Alliance. And Piedmont Housing Alliance is a affordable housing organization in our community. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. And just a little background of me, I'm from a very large Lebanese immigrant family. Um, was farmed for a couple of decades and worked with the Community Food Security Coalition around that. So had the experience of really being able to see so many projects all around the country that are doing this dynamic work. I was living in New Orleans, got booted with Hurricane Katrina, and came to Charlottesville and started to do that work here, which is not my longtime home, but I've been here now for about 20 years. Um, and I worked with an organization called Cultivate Charlottesville. Cecilia, I saw you on there, one of the 100, one of our partners that works on food justice. And so I'm going to use an example from Cultivate and an example from Piedmont Housing Alliance, where I work now. And the connection is that Piedmont Housing Alliance, even though it's focused on affordable housing, we have a partnership with Cultivate Charlottesville. We have a farm at one of our housing sites. So you'll hear about some of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today and about community engagement. So before we go there, we're just going to I'm going to start by breaking us all into groups and explore a little bit more about this topic of what community, what belonging, what community engagement looks like. So Susan and Emma are going to break us into groups of 3 to 5 and a few instructions. So each group, we ask that you focus on, have one person volunteer to be the Mentimeter input. I'm going to give you a link to Mentimeter. You'll go into the group. One person will go to the Mentimeter, and there's 2 questions. There's the first slide is the slide we just looked at, and then the 2 follow-up slides are, actually, I'll show them here for you. Questions on the 2 follow-up slides are, what does authentic community engagement mean to you? And just like typing in a lot of that we responded to in the first one about what you enjoy and what that might look like. And then what does authentic community engagement look like in practice? So, what kind of practices might you do? And this is just going to be a really fast, quick speed round. You'll get back into your groups later when we'll have an opportunity to work more on them together. So yeah, with that introduction, I'll allow Susan to go into the breakup group. Are there any questions before we go on?
Just a quick overview. You'll be in breakouts for 10 minutes. One person, please open up the link to the Mentimeter so you can complete the questions, and then just introduce yourself so that this can continue to be a time for folks to get to know each other. All right, Jeanette, we've got everybody back.
Okay, thank you all so much. Part of the experience of community engagement is really about taking the time to hear multiple inputs. So we were kind of laughing because some people left as soon as we broke into groups, and that, and I'm like that too. Sometimes I'm just like, I'm multitasking, I'm there to listen and, having to participate. And so there are times when community engagement is appropriate and other times when it's not. And so that's like part of the lesson. So I skipped this first question. Can you all see this okay? These are some of the results from what you all shared, to the first question about what does it mean to you? And these are somewhat similar to what we heard before, but also I saw in here, I think I saw paradox, reciprocity, decolonization, shared decision power, vested sustainability. So these are all really critical and complex concepts and practices to put into action. And so we're gonna talk more about what that looks like as we go. And then what does it look like in practice? And this is just kind of straightforward. Maybe you didn't get to this question, but really some of these clear things: humility, listening, empathy, shared spaces, common goals, exchange, reciprocity. So thank you all for these. It's really helpful at the beginning to get a sense of where folks are at and what's on your mind about these concepts. As we talk about community engagement, and there's so many different modes of this model, but there's a spectrum, a continuum of what community engagement looks like. It's starting with informing all the way to empowering. And we're going to look at each of these just a little bit and to explore like what does that look like and what are examples of some of that. So I think in each situation, it's really important to start with a plan about what degree and being really frank about what degree of community engagement you want to have for that particular activity. And today, I mean, we're not really going to be able to cover the whole idea of like how you set up a community engagement process, but what we're going to focus on is deepening community engagement through interventions. So thinking about like if you're at the inform stage now and you want to be to the involved stage, what is a practice that you can go through to move up the continuum to more? And here they use empower, and I always think like I prefer to use shared power or just power. Empower is like you can't really empower another person. One empowers themselves, but we can remove barriers and limits to people's capacity to do that. So we looked at this. I looked at this before in the workshop that we did for the community food projects programs in terms of if you think about food justice along that continuum, it looks somewhat similar. And so I'm starting with like food access and just providing access to food sources. And often those are ones that are donated that may not be very healthy or might not be the foods that we prefer. Food security moves into not only increasing access, but making sure that the basic food needs are met. Food justice, food equity moves even deeper. And this is an image from the Food Corps. This image, food justice is social justice. So moving into more systems change and working across systems. And then food sovereignty, this image is from the Environmental Center in Oregon, is really about owning and having the decision making and the ability to create a food system from beginning to end. And so that's just a brief overview of how the food system applies to this tool of community engagement. And decision making and shared power is such a key part of that. So as I mentioned, what you might want to do, and again, I can't see anybody, so please feel free to interrupt or let me know if someone has a question. Some questions as you're getting started.
Sorry, can you go back? You just went really quickly through the last slide. I didn't see
Yeah.
it between. Yeah, that one. Okay,
Oh,
sorry.
yeah, it's just kind of
Oops.
like an arrow of like
Oh,
it's just
yeah,
the
yeah.
idea that decision making is so critical to moving along that and sharing the ability to make decisions and who makes decisions.
Thank you.
Yeah. So here are some questions that you can ask yourself when you're creating a community engagement plan. Starting from what are the goals of the community engagement effort? And again, having those goals be flexible enough that they can be shaped by the engagement, but the overall goals. How are you planning to use the information? How will it translate into implementation? Who are the folks that you're wanting to work with? What are the cultural norms? Where is community engagement budget coming from? Being sure that we can really stay true to our promise. Who are the key community stakeholders, and what promotional strategies might you use? So these are just some of the logistical questions that you might ask. I think some of the deeper questions behind this that aren't articulated here are like, what are the values underlying? That's the place where I always start with what are the values that you are hoping to glean from this community engagement process? And I think that helps to answer many of these questions. And we'll look at that with one of the examples. So this is again, a very brief overview of like what each of these look like. So if you decide that you're just doing an information campaign and that the visual looks at like that means information is going out. And actually, I can't see you all, but can folks just do like a thumbs up or thumbs down if you've seen this model before? Because it's a really basic model. I don't want to spend too much time on it if folks are really familiar with it. And Susan or Emma, maybe you can tell me where people are leaning. Thumbs up if you're used to it, thumbs down if it's new.
It looks like it's pretty new for a lot of
Okay.
folks. Maybe there's a
Okay.
handful of folks that have seen this before,
Okay.
or this continuum.
So yeah, and so the first one is inform. You're providing balanced, objective information. So that could be through website, through flyers, videos, all of these ways that we inform folks. It's basically a one-way thing, and information is important. So if you have an event coming up where all of these things are important, it's not that it's less important. It's just not on the scale of community engagement. So these are some examples. Moving on to consult. If you do a poll, like I just did right now, trying to get like just instead of just informing, checking in, how are folks doing? Do you want to hear this information? Having focus groups or interviews where you're gleaning information from folks and then you're taking that and doing something with it. This could be a town hall discussion. It could be a workshop like this, going door to door, an open house, a comment box. These are all different consulting ways. Involve. I'm sorry, I'm just going to go back for a second and you'll see the arrow is switched. So you're not just giving information out, you're collecting information from the individuals that you're engaging with. Involve includes both informing and collecting information. So here are some examples. Community mapping, where you bring a group of folks together, you tell them about the goal of the process, you might outline, you might provide information about some of the history in the sites, and then you glean feedback. Design charrettes. Has anyone here been involved in design charrettes? Okay, and we use them a lot at Piedmont Housing Alliance when we did redevelopment of our housing site. The residents actually designed how they wanted the site to look, where they wanted it to lay out. Mind mapping, participatory budgeting is a process where you bring folks together and you actually say, okay, we have this pot of money. These are the priorities that were established. How do we want to do that? Our local school did that recently, where students got to pick what they could add to the playground based on a budget and all of that. Does anyone
Can you
have any
see
other?
your slide is cutting off the last line in this? I don't know if anybody
Yeah,
else has that problem, and I'm not sure what it says. Include them, blank, blank.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
it's like the little like yellow bar for
Yeah, sorry about
advancing
that.
is
I'm not
covering
able
it.
to change it right now.
Yeah.
But it basically, when I share it with you, I'll make sure it's fixed. And these descriptors are about a public engagement. I'll also share the link with you that I got it from. So it's not maybe as aligned as, the language that what it means, include folks in the process, in the
Mm.
setting priorities.
Jeanette, there was a request if you could go back to the previous slide, and I think it
Sure.
was for the consult.
Uh-huh.
Kelly, did you have a question about consult?
No, I was just trying to copy the slide.
Oh,
Okay,
we're going to share them with
we'll
you,
get these
honestly.
out to you.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Yeah, I
that's why
just
it's
heard.
going so
Thank you.
fast.
Yeah, yeah. And y'all, yeah, continue to please just put, comments, questions in the chat and speak up because that's what this is all about.
Absolutely. Um, we talked about involve. I wondered if there were any other ideas about how or ways that you all involve community in this two-way communication, making sure that you're communicating about the situation that's at hand, the issues, and including folks in giving feedback on the priorities.
I guess the question is this still kind of intending there's like a teacher and a learner scenario, or are you like asking for leadership?
Yeah, definitely. You're still setting the agenda, right? So you're still there saying, okay, this is the situation, these are the areas, and this is where we want feedback on. Okay, so if we can't think of any examples there, we'll move on. Collaborate is moving more towards having that shared decision making. That I would even make that first little ball a little smaller. So you're partnering in a co-creation of something, maybe setting up working groups or having an open space visioning where it's not just coming together where you define what you're visioning about, but participants can also define. Partner forums, forming networks. I said hello to Cecilia, who's part of a local network here that I was a part of, the Food Justice Network, where there is one organization that kind of like sets the tone and the outline and the topics, but we have different presenters that come and share information kind of like this. Any other examples that folks have experienced with Collaborate?
want to have an example, but I have a thought about these various levels. They seem very linear,
Yeah.
whereas in actual practice, I think as an organization, we're constantly moving from one to the other. There's one case in which we're just informing the community we have this workshop going on. In another case, we have clients who become volunteers, who then become leaders, and then they influence the programs and the adjustments we make, right? And so it seems like all of these I feel like organizations that are deeply embedded in the community they're serving are likely to touch on each of these in turn.
Yes, I really appreciate. I'm sorry, who was that spoke?
My name's North. I'm here in Puyallup, Washington.
Hi, North. Yeah, thank you so much for adding that. Like the visual would be so much better, like in this complex mind map way. And I think the point of laying it out like this is that it's important to be clear of what you're doing in each situation so that community members aren't set up in a situation where they think it's a collaboration and it's more just about information, or they think it's shared power, so being clear as to, okay, when are we going to pull on this tool and when are we going to pull on that tool, is how I tend to use this. So I appreciate those comments. And then the final one looks at empower or share power. So the way this has looked in examples that I've seen is where community members are leadership and staff. We are the ones doing the program or doing the work, setting the priorities, focusing on asset-based community development, where you work in your community to identify the areas of strengths and growth and then build on those, not starting necessarily with a problem. Community cohorts with clear decision making. You'll see an example at Piedmont Housing Alliance where we have 3 different cohorts of residents that make decisions, and each of them have a scope of decision making that they can influence. Or having a community define the indicators and the evaluation tools. When we talked about whole measures in the community food project presentation, we talked about being able to work with the community to define what success looks like, what evaluation looks like. And that power and decision making is in the community's hands. Do folks have examples of this? And I'm just going to stop sharing for a minute because I'd really love to see y'all's faces. Does anyone else want to add reflections to North's comments about how these are all happening intertwined and at the similar time?
Yeah, North put
Each
a
level is like
nice
a
like kind
mode.
of summary in the chat there. Like each level is like a mode of operation, and an organization may move back and forth between all different modes depending on the season, the project, the community needs, etc. The important thing is to communicate clearly for a shared understanding of what mode is in operation at the moment.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
The only thing I would add is that it can be super confusing to people if you're switching back and forth between modes because they're not always hearing what you're saying. They're not as familiar with all these different ways of engaging community members and opening the door for their opinion to be heard. And so I find that misconnect or disconnect can sometimes cause challenges.
Have you used any tools to address that or to help make it more clear?
I'm just making a general observation, yes.
Yeah, Liz, thank you. It's great to see you. In sharing power, it's especially important to delineate areas of responsibility. So speaking about her farm CSA, the members made decisions about how the food was distributed, what food they wanted, quantities, but the farmers decided how to grow the food, what seeds to purchase, when to plant, when to harvest. That's a great example.
Hi everyone. I don't really have a clear example as far as like how I'm doing this well, but I'm figuring I'm figuring out how to try to communicate this clearly. My example is that I'm the coordinator for a land access program in New Jersey. So we offer long-term affordable land access on preserved farmland. So when the program started, it was very much like we have our like organizational board and committees like making all of the decisions and setting everything up. And as we're a few years in, we're realizing, this is a long-term land access program and the farmers that are participating really should have a bigger say in like how things are going down. So navigating that is definitely a challenge, and then figuring out how to, which scenarios are appropriate for the more like board organization of our full or the board members of our full organization to be having the decision-making power on, and which ones are more community-based, and kind of me as the person in the middle, and how to kind of juggle all of that and navigate it. So I'm really appreciating this conversation. I'm sorry I don't have more to like add as far as how we're putting that into practice, but I just wanted to offer that as an example of when this is quite confusing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much. And please, if you think of other examples or questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So one more before we move back to sharing some of the examples I brought with me. Hester shared that we aspire to the level of empowerment, but I think we've been in the position as a nonprofit of receiving funding that requires us to provide services in a certain way dictated by the funder without being able to adjust it to community generated ideas. Yeah, everyone's shaking their heads. How similar of an issue is that, right? Okay, so I'll just go back and share you just a few examples. So as I mentioned, I worked with Cultivate Charlottesville, which is a local food justice organization here in Charlottesville, Virginia, for about over 11 years. And we grew from a city schoolyard garden focused to being kind of a systems approach to food justice. With three focuses. One is city schoolyard garden, leadership building, like focusing on youth engagement and leadership, looking at urban agriculture, growing food at affordable housing sites like Piedmont Housing and other areas in the city, and then sharing that food. And then third, forming a food justice network of partners in the community that work together to have policy change at the city level. So their process of community engagement focused on using the whole measures frame to define, like, so each group defined what their values and areas of influence are. And so you'll see this little B frame. This is their equity framework that looks at the areas, realizing that to be a food justice network, it's not just about delivering food. It's about creating strong communities, honoring culture and identity, having vibrant farms, looking at healthy people, sustainable ecosystems, thriving local economies, and also policies and justice and fairness. And so they outline these practices. So when we were speaking earlier about how it's important to start with those values, even more than the questions that were up there, that then you know that they can guide you as you go throughout the process. So this is what Cultivate's equity framework looks like. And this is just 1 year. I took part of the year and looked at all the different ways that community was engaged in giving input. So the main question was, what does a just and equitable food system look like in Charlottesville? And each of these ways they went through to glean feedback from community on what that might look like. So they were going to events and having people vote on, with sticky dots about which priorities they cared about. They were meeting with 12 different city departments and hearing what the city departments, what their priorities were around food equity. Going into the neighborhood, doing interviews, all of these different ways of engaging community, having tours of the local farms in the area, talking with the school board, all of those ways. So and this is just one example. It was actually like a 3-year process. And out of that, we were able to identify these 6 priorities for policy. So the Food Equity Policy Platform Overview compiled all of this information together and identified it in 6 core areas that the city and the community could impact change. Starting with food equity and justice as like the underlying theme, advancing systemic change and collective movements, and then moving into each of these core areas. So advancing affordable housing and urban agriculture. And you'll see each of them are both and scenarios at the intersection of affordable housing and urban agriculture, at the intersection of access to food and transportation, at the intersection of healthy school foods and student choice, at the intersection of building community wealth and local markets to having access, and then again at the intersection of climate and justice. And each of these 6 areas, we're not going to go over them now, but had specific policy recommendations for each of the departments. And each department has a plan on how they're going to address those. So one of the key ones, Cecilia, again, I'll refer to you, the power to grow about it. So this is one of the our housing sites right here, and this is a farm that Cultivate Charlottesville grew and shared the food. And many of these sites were being lost to redevelopment, really necessary redevelopment. So one of the goals was to ensure that some land was set aside to urban agriculture. And in the process of development of our small city, which is just 10 square miles, they weren't getting ignored. We weren't losing all of our urban agriculture area. And one of the wins was that the IRC New Roots program, with that Cecilia that represents, was able to restore and ensure, like, is it a 99-year lease, Cecilia, on the land that you have?
We're not yet there, but we're moving swiftly in that direction. And,
Okay, great.
Traction of the Food Equity Initiative has really, really helped to build momentum.
Well, thank you for letting me put you on the spot there. And so these were some of the ways that they engaged community in practices. They did youth photo story, and they were able to do this because we had already had a youth internship program over years where youth had been engaged in this and had been learning. We did a comprehensive analysis of the comprehensive plan that the city was updating and ended up making 65 additions to the comprehensive plan that specifically addressed food equity, including a chapter on food equity and climate change. So over those 3 to 5 years, we're able to have some of that impact. And I think that's any questions about Cultivate? These are just ideas to plant seeds. Okay, Piedmont Housing Alliance. So Piedmont Housing Alliance is a 40-year-old property right in the center of town. It was once a plantation. Well, I mean, before that, it was, of course, indigenous land. We have the Monacan, are the land that we are on here in Charlottesville. The land then was settled and became a plantation very close to Thomas Jefferson's plantation. It was, the area around it was raised during urban renewal, where it had transferred to a very vibrant Black community that was then raised for a business area that was built in, like a pedestrian mall with businesses that were all white businesses, and the Black families were moved to public housing. So there's like this history of oppression and stealing resources and, destruction. So when Piedmont Housing Alliance began to think about, okay, how are we going to redevelop this land with the idea of the history and the place and the respect for the folks, we met with residents, and the residents defined what they're calling the spatial justice pillars. And these are 5 core areas that they identified that throughout the development process, they wanted us to focus on. Cultural belonging and empathy, healing and well-being, shared power, generational wealth, and homes to thrive. So, and actually it was just these 4, the homes to thrive is added because that was like already assumed, right? Like we're building the homes, but homes to thrive was a phrase that residents came up with in terms of how they wanted to do this. And so then they also had an articulation of what that meant to them. So just to take one, for example, what would healing and well-being look like? It would look like we have created the space and support to address past harms and to access care, joy, and a good quality of life. And each of these have really beautiful, I think, descriptions of what that means. So residents have, for shared power, residents have clear pathways to leadership and decision-making in community redevelopment and partner services. And then they took each of these areas and they mapped them for what kind of programs they would want to see. So for cultural belonging and empathy, ideas that came out of that were storytelling, explicit celebration of immigrants, doing a community survey, having orientation welcome kits as folks moved in to help them acclimate to our culture. And then each of these suggestions were evaluated, and we're in the process of reevaluating them now in terms of, okay, which ones are active, which ones are in the process, and which ones have we not yet addressed. And so this is a very active and example of like how this long process of engagement. I'll just let you look at this for a minute. And again, you'll have a copy of this. And the most important thing is the process that went through to get here. Are there any questions? or comments? And I just wanted to show a little picture. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 resident cohorts at Piedmont Housing Alliance. Well, even more than that. Oh, go ahead, Liz. I just saw you raise your
How
hand.
much diversity ethnically or economically was there within that community you're working on?
Yeah, so when it started in the 70s, it was about 95% Black. It was African American residents. Charlottesville has a very a very large International Rescue Committee organization that our New Roots program is with, and we do receive immigrants. And so it's changed very much. It's now about 80% of new Americans, and the I think that's what it is. And so much of the Black population has shrunk in proportion as we've had more housing. So it's pretty diverse right now through the years. But there's still an interest in remaining true to that history of it being a previous plantation site, and how and the harms of urban renewal, what happened there. And these are just some photos of a few of our redevelopment advisory board members. So thank you for that question, Liz. So these are ways that residents can engage in leadership opportunities. We have residents on our board of directors. It's required in our bylaws. We have JEDI youth ambassadors, so youth that participate in a summer program and then stay on as part of the organizational ways that we define community engagement. We have the redevelopment advisory board. So these are some of the photos that you see here. It's residents that were voted in by their peers who are paid to work with the real estate development on defining all of our what each building will look like, what types of affordable housing will be included in them, all the way down to the type of carpet, the spigots, the windows, and then following up on that, and also being a liaison between the redevelopment process and the consultants. We're also in the process of forming a resident association. For the residents came and they wanted to come back. In the 70s, there was a really vibrant resident leadership around culture and community, and that's how the farm got started. The idea of that bore out of the 70s, 80s, and 90s work. And so bringing that back. And then we currently also have an Our Town committee, which was part of a grant from the National Endowment on the Arts. Charlottesville, if any of you know our history, know that the taking down of a Robert E. Lee statue was a flashpoint in our community that spurred the Unite the Right rallies. The Ku Klux Klan marched down our city. A young woman was killed by a driver that that plowed through the crowd. And so art in place, and I just got chills thinking about that. Art in place is a very big part of our journey towards freedom from oppression, and moving more towards that. So we, as part of the redevelopment, there will be a community farm will be brought back, and there will be an art piece in there that the residents get to decide and work on, as well as they're just choosing the art within the building. So our next thing is like, how can we increase community engagement? And so I'm just bringing one tool today about, as I mentioned before, about community engagement interventions. And this is an intervention basically is an action that you can take to improve a situation, to, I'll just let you read these yourselves, but it's a educational or policy strategy or systemic change that can help create the change that you want. And we use this language because it really needs to be active. It really needs to be a break sometimes, because as we know, we're very embedded in dominant culture norms, which are not based on community engagement in so many ways, right? They're based on hierarchies and various ways of keeping the order and structure. And so we need to intervene both in our minds and in our actions around that. And these are just examples of like, and please feel free to chime out too. What are types of interventions? If you guys want to add into the chat, like what are ways that you can intervene and change something? You can change a policy. You can change someone's belief. You can change the understanding of history, not history itself. The way that you celebrate, the traditions that you have. I'm going to just keep popping these up. Does anyone else want to come off mic and just share a type of intervention? I'm so sorry I can't see you all. It's so weird. You can change who the decision makers are, what the process is, what the stories are that you tell, who has access to things, who has resources,
Got a
rules.
couple comments in the chat around relationships and modeling new practices.
Great. There's so many different types of interventions. So basically, we also can look at them this way in terms of their interpersonal between people. They can be institutional, the decision makers, the policies, the traditions. They can be systematic, who has access, what the culture or cultural practices are. Again, policies fall in here as well, investments, processes. And then, they can be structural, which is the combination of institutional and systematic. And if you notice, this also aligns with the type of racism that there is. And so it's really about these interventions are really about breaking interpersonal racism, institutional racism, systemic racism in all of these ways is the model that we're using. So, for example, at Piedmont Housing Alliance, we have, I mentioned, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Department, as long as racial equity is an undergirding current of that. And so we ask ourselves, we define these questions, how can we move an action more towards JEDI and racial equity? And I'll just leave this up here for a second. These are some of the questions we ask ourselves. And so I'm going to share a sheet with you all. Let me just do that now.
I have a question when there's time.
Yeah, please go ahead while I'm doing this. That would be great.
Okay, great. A couple of slides back, you were talking about, we've been talking about community engagement, and you listed some ways for the residents to be engaged. And I was just wondering what incentives are set up for them to participate. It sounded like you said that they were mandatory. And I find with working with frontline communities, right, time is not something that they always have. So how have you been able to navigate those, and community engagement and commitment, understanding that they have a heart to be involved and engaged. However, time is not always a privilege that those.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that they were mandatory. That's not it at all, but they are paid. So the cohorts that I mentioned are all paid positions that folks engage with. It's not like a long-term full-time position, but they're paid for their engagement in terms, like they choose to be part of it and then they commit to it and engage in that process. Do other folks want to share how you also respond to folks in terms of community engagement while I get this document set up? Does that respond to your question?
Yes, in the way that you incentivize the residents to participate, I think that is really important. I know in the past we've done dinners and raffles, and also like gas cards if people had to show up to meetings outside of their homes. I just want to be mindful that yes, community engagement and community involvement in our projects is really important. However, we have to take into consideration that it's almost a privilege to be in some of these spaces. And how do we incentivize the folks that we really want to engage with? It's their time, which is extremely valuable to frontline communities.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I will say, like, for each situation, it's been a little bit different. Like the cohorts, they're paid regular amounts. We've also, when we did the survey and asked questions of 300 folks, that we asked, it was done by residents. So first of all, it was community advocates that did the surveys. They were paid to do that, and they decided on what the incentive would be, and they decided on a gift card to a grocery store. So, each situation is different, and making sure that residents have the capacity to make those choices about what that looks like. So this is a worksheet that we're going to do. And again, we don't have a ton of time, so we won't be able to get into it, but it'll be a resource that you can use. So this is an example, and there's a lot of text on here, so I'm just going to share one or two examples. These are the questions that I showed on the previous slide and some of the ways that we answered them at Piedmont Housing Alliance. Write down a description of an activity that you would like to see deeper engagement in, and then begin to think about any of these questions that relate to you, and you'll have these to refer to as an answer. Or as an example, not an answer. So this is the example from Piedmont Housing Alliance. And then I've also included an example. This is an amazing tool that I really like from the SFU Morris J. Center for Dialogue. And they talk about what are the principles of equitable public engagement. And these are their 8 principles right here on the left: authentic engagement, proactive planning. And this is not a tool from them. These are their principles. And then I kind of added questions that you might ask. So it's not really a cookie cutter response, like a way that you can do these interventions, but you can create the template through which your values are reflected in the questions that you might ask yourself. So for Piedmont Housing Alliance, for example, each staff member goes through and they say, my goal is, for example, to share meals with community members, host bingo with the seniors, and share meals. And how can I create that in a way that, is this a way that this can respond to heal past harms? How can this action center those impacted? And the example I used here was the redevelopment of the 40-year-old housing project, which is now Kindlewood. Spend some time thinking about this for an action that you have and begin to explore some questions that you might ask yourself.
Anybody
Okay, great.
willing to share something that you have going on right now that you want to give a little bit of thought to and get some feedback from your colleagues? It could be a really good opportunity.
The timing is really great for me right now because our local farmers market has been in existence for the last 15 seasons. This will be our 16th season, and it's been operated by a board of 7 vendors, and it has run on a shoestring. There's only the last 7 years have we been able to get grant money to help with any funding. The vendor fees have been able to pay for advertising on the radio, which has been the bulk of our advertising, along with a few banners. The grants recently have been able to help pay for a part-time staff who would be at the market, all 3 markets that we've had through the week during the season, but then during the winter, they would work with our vendors to do their business plans and things like that. We're at a place where I have been the one who's done the administrative work in the past, and I am a sandwich person where I'm taking care of my mother and my grandchildren. And we have a farm, and my husband has had some health issues as well. And so I have got to lighten the things that I'm carrying in the community. And so I'm trying I went to the city council, and I've gone to the county commissioners, and we've contacted community organizations that are interested in seeing that the farmers market continues. But we have had our first working group meeting a week or so ago, and there's a consent that they want to make sure that the farmers market continues, but city government doesn't move very fast, and the commissioners, they are willing to help with the marketing, some funds for marketing and that kind of a thing. But we have still got to we've got a lot of work yet to figure out how and who is going to do the administrative duties for the farmers market in order for them to continue to take SNAP and double up food bucks and, those kind of things somebody has to know what they're doing. So we're looking for ideas on how and where to look for those resources for filling these shoes. I would be glad to share with them the things that need to be done. But I need to find the people who will do it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Debbie, for sharing this. And I just want you to know I appreciate the position that you're in terms of like being that sandwich person and also running a farm. It's a lot to hold. So I will say, I think one of the main things is community engagement. That things that I've been outlining took years, right? Like they took over 3 years, 2 to 3 years for each of those examples to engage, and they took resources. So I think starting with the question of how do I engage community is probably not the right, or how do I like deepen an intervention is probably not the right question for you.
Okay.
It seems to me that your question might go all the way back to the beginning to realizing that, okay, we have this farmers market that's wonderful, but that cannot be funded or held anymore on your back, that it needs to be a community resource. So going through that process of, does the community want this? Like, I think you're back at the beginning of some of those core questions. What are the values? Who are the stakeholders? Who is engaged in this? So I would go back to the one slide that had all of those questions that I went through very quickly, but I think it's because where you are, you want to be able to identify who is the community that can hold this. Because in the position that you're in, as I think it was Cecilia or Selena, I'm not sure, maybe it was you, Selena, who was sharing that you can't like put this burden on the grassroots community members aren't going to be able to pick this up. Like folks who don't have food access will not be able to hold a situation that's already overwhelmed. It needs to be a place of abundance. I didn't mention that before, but usually this kind of work needs to happen at a place of abundance where you create a situation where community has the resources they need, even in that moment, to engage, because otherwise it's going to be too much. So my recommendation to you would be, first of all, it's really hard and it might not make it, right? And that's just part of the realization of it's okay for you to set your own personal boundaries and limits in terms of what a community can hold. But then reaching out, bringing those partners together that you talked about, that you're already doing, and asking those questions and seeing if you can come up with like a clear plan for how this can be a shared ownership piece. So that's a very vague and not direct answer, but hopefully it points you in more of the direction of like where to start with that. Does anyone else want to respond to Debbie? Because that's a really challenging, process. We've had in Charlottesville alone over the past few years, we've had 3 community food organizations that were going for 10 plus years close because there was no longer the funding or the impetus or the support for that because of other needs that emerged.
I think I'll just offer that a lot of times we take things for granted that are offered in our communities and don't really know what's going on to like really hold them in place. We saw a great example of this yesterday with the federal aid freeze and suddenly everyone going, oh, wait, hold on a second. All the nonprofits that hold all this together are the ones that are impacted. And so I've been in a situation with a very small nonprofit that I had started that has now lived for 20 years. And it's gone through a couple of cycles of almost shutting down. And in each one of those times, we made it known that like this is going to stop unless a new generation of folks get engaged. And like we really like it required a lot of transparency and vulnerability to say, hey guys, we can't keep doing this. We're out of money. People aren't showing up. Like this is going to end. Do you care about it? And something about that, and I know it's just kind of the opposite of what you're saying, Jeanette, because it's not coming from a place of abundance. It's more of like, this is about to go away. But each time new people stepped into that void and brought new energy into it. And right now, that organization, it's called the Noyo Food Forest, if you ever want to check it out, is thriving. And it was coming out of one of those times when it was really, kind of in a compost phase. So
That's really,
sometimes that's the way to go.
yeah. And Susan, the folks that have responded, are they frontline community members that face food insecurity as well?
It was a combination. Yeah, particularly of moms of the high school students. It's a farm at a high school. And there's a kind of a circle back of
Mhm.
food distribution that happens through this farm. So yeah, it was a combination of folks who had some time
Yeah.
and then folks who were like, this is going to impact my kids
Yeah.
and I want to get
And
involved.
And I think even though what we said came from different places, it's not like we have to hold that paradox, right? Of that there are sometimes solutions that are like coming from completely different places, that are really important to address.
Yeah.
I appreciate the ideas.
Yeah.
And I told him that I will give him this year, and but when the market's over this summer, because it's likely that the farmers market is going to be kind of a bare bones thing this summer, because the vendors want the market to continue, the shoppers want the market to continue, and it's just a kind of a thing where the community has got to figure out how they're going to put everything together for consistency for it to continue.
Yeah.
And so I'm open to whatever the community, however they want for it to go, because there is a strong support for it, especially among the shoppers and the vendors. So
Yeah.
I'm sure that they'll figure out something, but getting there.
I just put this link back to that, the resource that had been shared, and just really encourage all to like get in there and download that document, because this is a really great tool. There's some really good questions. And I was just looking at it and thinking about an event that has been sort of brewing for me and engaging the Food Systems Leadership Network more broadly. And just even these prompts has been really helpful in just a couple minutes to be like, oh, I need to think about that. Oh, that's a really good question for me to consider. So thank you. And I hope that that can be something that others will take advantage of. Jeanette, I wonder if there's anything you want to say to kind of like wrap up the conversation and point people to other resources.
Thank you, Susan. I just want to, I think, emphasize that. Oh, yeah, sorry, hold on. I will kind of pull back to my slides. Some of the foundational pieces that have highlighted. So just to kind of summarize, is that it's really helpful to have a foundational framework. So at Piedmont Housing Alliance, we started with those values of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. At the second example I shared, they started with the principles. So starting with those principles or values can help as you develop a community engagement project. Thinking about the scale and the capacity that you have in order to be accountable to community. Because whenever you are asking community to give of their time, especially folks who are facing a lot of barriers, it's really important that you can be accountable to them. So moving the scale along to which you can be responsible, having clear structures and processes and ways of working through conflict together and taking time to develop those, and then having strong partners and advocates that you can lean on, are really important. And then providing support for residents, not just incentives, but support in all different ways that they might need to engage for community members. And then areas that I think can be more challenging, that might take a little bit more care for an organization that is not used to community engagement, is one, having consistent funding, because it takes a lot longer. And as someone said in the chat, maybe your funding doesn't want to do it. Having staff that's skilled in cultural competencies where you can engage with community members in a way that creates these moments of abundance. Again, the clear structure and process, and then being able to have complex interests and intersections. So that you'll see a slide that has a little bit more about that when I share it with you. And I'm really happy to summarize the information in some links. There are so many resources out there for you. It's almost overwhelming that you can dig into. So thank you for inviting me, and I really enjoy being here.
Thank you so much, Jeanette, and to everybody for offering your insights and questions, and challenges. It's awesome. And that's what this community of practice is all about. So we will follow up with the recording and the slides and the documents for everybody that's registered. So we'll send that along. Emma, before we kind of stop the recording, is there any updates and announcements you want to make? And then we'll stop the recording and just have some candid conversation.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, we are going to start doing follow-up discussion groups to the community of practice. And so we're really happy that Jeanette has agreed to come back to do a follow-up discussion for this community of practice. We got some feedback from people that they'd like more time to just dig into the content and talk about it. So the follow-up discussion group for this will be February 5th, 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern time. I'm going to drop the registration link in the chat right now. So if you're interested in coming to that, please do. As Susan said, we'll send out the recording, the slides from Jeanette, and then also you'll get information about this discussion group and reminded about it. Our next call for Community of Practice is February 26th. We don't have a topic yet for that, but we're working to figure that out. And given that you guys are all registered, you will be first on the list to hear what our next topic is. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Yeah. And if y'all have any, things that are alive that you really want to talk about, let us know, because we've got some like lists that we draw from each month and go, okay, like after right when we come out of this community practice call, we're always like, okay, what's next? What's the next conversation, and start crafting that. So please, bring those ideas forward. And also just want to recommend, if you're going to participate in that discussion group next week, try out this tool. Take half an hour on one day in this next week and try to work through an activity that will give you some really juicy questions to bring to Jeanette next Friday. And thank you, Jeanette, for that. And let's stop the recording.